Hi guys, and welcome to another Platform to Perform episode. In today's vlog, I'm going to be talking about questions that were sent to me by professional boxer Carwyn. So Carwyn asks about recovery for somebody who's over 30 years old, how to balance being competitively fit versus maintaining a healthy body, and when to factor in rest. More specifically, he asked whether he should just rest when he feels like it or whether that should be planned into the program. And in this presentation, I'm going to discuss what my thoughts are in relation to that. So the first thing to say when it comes to being over 30 years old is that the body doesn't magically change when you go from being 29 years and 364 days to when you're 30. Now, the reason why I use this extreme example is because I see a lot of stuff in social media or just in general fitness world that says about what you should be doing at specific ages in time. Now, I do believe that you need to train age appropriately, but there is a lot of caveats that come with that. For example, a 47-year-old Bernard Hopkins winning a version of the world title looks very differently to, say, if you got a 47-year-old desk worker. However, for me, there is always going to be three recovery strategies which are going to provide the biggest bang for your buck. Number one is sleep. This is going to help you both physiologically, psychologically, hormonally, and to be honest, there's just so many reasons why sleep will always be your number one recovery tool. If you want more information on this, go and check out Matthew Walker's TED Talk, Why Sleep is Your Superpower, or just buy his book. So should those recovery methods change? I don't think so. So for me, getting enough sleep, making sure you're hydrated because that's going to affect decision making, and making sure that your nutrition is on point. What I mean by this is that you're getting the calories you need relative to your training goal, that you're making sure you get adequate protein so that your muscles are able to recover, and just being savagely consistent with these basic recovery strategies. Now, yes, there's plenty of recovery strategies such as, for example, ice baths, using Under Armour, or using, for example, thermal skins. But to be honest, if you're not sleeping right, eating right, and making sure you're hydrated, those other things, they're all the cherry on top. And in regards to those recovery strategies specifically, there's literature coming out all the time that says, for example, should you use ice baths? Should you use hot then cold? And there's so many, this study says this, do it this way, this study says do it that way. Get 9 hours of sleep a night. That's just my personal recommendation. Anything under 6, and I don't care who you are handicapping performance, but make sure you're setting that consistent sleep cycle so your body knows when to feel tired, it knows when to feel awake. And doing that over time is going to do much more for your recovery than, for example, this or that fancy supplement. And also, final thought, just going back to recovery in your 30s, it's not so much an age thing, but it's more that the longer that you've been training for, the more likely it is that your body has accumulated injuries and certain things you've got to be considerate of. Not so much that the age is the issue, but more the time spent doing the same sport or physical activity over and over again. So that would be more of a consideration, and how, for example, previous injury history is going to impact your ability to recover. That's more of an issue than age per se, but it's more likely if you're older that you're going to have injury issues. Now, this was a really interesting question. I like this. So Carwyn asked about the differences between or how to make sure, for example, you can sustain being competitively fit and healthy. Now, what I think is important is to define what you mean by each term. Now, just because Carwyn's a professional boxer, I'm going to naturally assume competitively fit to mean getting ready to fight, and healthy being what I would call just ticking over. And this is where, for me, the importance between what Dan John describes as park bench workouts versus bus bench workouts. So let me describe the difference between those two things. So if you're sat on a park bench, you are just watching the world go by. You're not in any specific rush. You don't have to get results right now. You're just basically ticking over. If you're sat on a bench, and you're waiting for a bus, and the timetable tells you the bus is going to be there at 2 minutes past 1, you expect that bus to be there at 2 minutes past 1. So what I mean by this is, if you have a competition in the diary, or you know you've got a bout coming up on 18th of March, whatever it is, you expect to be in peak condition for the 18th of March. If you have no date in the diary, then what I would recommend you do is focus on making sure you've got range of motion. This can be done by performing loaded movements through full range of motion. So this might be something like goblet squats, RDLs, rear foot elevated split squats. You're not necessarily pushing close to failure, you're not necessarily lifting as heavy as you can possibly lift, but what you are doing is making sure you're building that base of physical qualities so that when the fight date does get announced, you've got something to build on. So you've got good range of motion, you've got enough range of motion that acts as a buffer for performance, so you've almost got more than what your actual sport requires of you. So in boxing, for example, you're never really going to be in an arse to grass deep squat. However, obviously in your boxing stance, you're in a bit of a quarter squat. So if you were to, for example, go super specific all the time and just quarter squat, then you're leaving mobility improvements on the table. And then when you need to be, for example, in the equivalent of a deep squat, when you're sprinting, for example, think about how high the knee up is relative to your torso. That's pretty much a full squat. You want to make sure that you've got that range of motion to get there. In terms of an aerobic base, if you're off season, I would be looking more to improve, for example, your pure speed. So this is going to be stuff like, for example, 30-meter sprints with a 2 to 3 minute recovery. These won't be that taxing in terms of, for example, feeling too fatigued the next day, but it is a massive stress on the nervous system because you're asking your body to perform as intensely as it can, but then you're giving it plenty of recovery. So focus on pure speed work on one end of the spectrum, focus on aerobic work. Now, when I say aerobic, long, slow runs are okay if you're off season or you're just doing it maybe to keep ticking over. But realistically, what I would want you doing is sessions that are in and around what I would call critical speed. Now, to find your critical speed, you'd have to message me because that's a separate presentation in of itself. But effectively, critical speed is what I would call your cruising pace. What pace can you sit at and it's pretty sustainable. If you're bumping that critical speed up or that cruising speed up over time, then when it comes to a fight day getting announced, that's when you've already got the means of recovering well in between high intensity efforts. But it also means that because you've been ticking over, the higher intensity efforts aren't as costly to your recovery. Going back to this question of recovery, if you're training too hard, too soon in your training cycle, not only are you going to break down, but when you need to be firing on all cylinders, you just haven't got that recovery capacity in you. So examples of aerobic base type work, stuff like 2 minutes on, 1 minute off, that's going to serve you well. Again, looking to hit a consistent pace. Or if you look at tempo type runs, so for example, about 70% of your best effort, but interval style, or even stuff like fartlek training, where you're, for example, picking a course, you'll have some elements where you're sprinting, some elements where it's a light jog, some elements where it's quite a fast jog. So you're just varying the intensity, but giving yourself enough of a stimulus that you're gradually improving. And the final thing to say on this is, by inching our effortless efforts up, our best gets better. So when we're talking about just being healthy or perhaps being off season, we're just looking to gradually get better where we can, whether that's technically, physiologically, or range of motion, whatever. So this is a really interesting question, one I like a lot. So when should I plan rest? So I've got a couple of thoughts on this. So if you have a competitive bout coming up, then just saying you're going to rest when you feel like it, that really isn't going to work. Because let's say, I don't know, you train, you keep noticing improvements, and then you get 1 week out from the fight and all of a sudden your performance drops. Well, just taking a week off before the fight, your sharpness is going to go and it's just not going to be helpful. Now, the important thing from a scientific perspective to know is what is known as the stimulus recovery adaptation curve, or the SRA curve for short. Now, if you look at the diagram, what you'll see is initially a stimulus is presented. Now, how I like to describe this is when you train, you're basically digging yourself a hole. When you recover, you're filling that hole back up. and when you adapt, you're almost putting more soil into the hole, so it's now bigger than what it originally was. So you're building your foundation. Now, depending on your level of training, how conditioned you are, and how long you've been training for, this curve is going to look slightly different. So for example, in my own training, I've deadlifted twice in the last 5 weeks, but I've maintained my strength pretty well. Now, the reason for that is I've trained for 5 years so that when I take time off, my strength doesn't deteriorate as quickly as it would, say, if I'd been training for 3 weeks. However, what's important to know is that in order to find out how long you should leave it before you rest, you're going to need to do this type of training off season. So to give you a personal example, when I was trying to qualify for nationals in powerlifting, I had 6 months, so a long time. And what we did when we were 6 months away, me and my coach, is we had a metric that we were going to look at each week. Now, if this metric was going up or improving, that was a sign we could probably do the same or maybe even a little bit more work. As soon as this metric starts to wobble, that's when you're keeping a closer eye on things. And when the metric starts to consistently fall away, and you know it's, for example, not just a bad week, that's when you can pull away. And by using that, we could determine when roughly me personally would need a break. However, the difficulty in doing that with boxing is first identifying a key metric. So, for example, if there was some hypothetical way of measuring punching power or punch output, you might train in the same way, and as long as that number's tracking well, you might continue to add stress or maybe even stay at the same workout whilst it's still working. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But the problem with boxing is there's so many different variables. So, for example, if your coach is catering for 30 other boxers, he's probably not individualizing the boxing session you're receiving. So in the week when you perhaps need a lighter week, he's probably not able to give you that. That's why you need to be recording how your training is making you feel, what you're doing in your training, and then it'll give you an idea when to pull back. Realistically, however, though, I would say you probably want to be pulling your training back probably every fourth week. So for example, you can do this a couple of ways, whether you reduce duration, so you still keep the intensity high, but let's say, I don't know, you normally do 10 hard 3-minute rounds on the bag on a Tuesday. Well, in your deload week, you might only do 5 hard rounds. So that's one way you can do it. There are, of course, several others, but that's context for a different video. One thing I will say is that you're going to need to push the envelope a little bit to the point where you almost break, and then you peel back if you are deciding to ad hoc when you add rest in. Not something you should probably be playing about with in season. If you're an amateur boxer, stay away from that. If you're a professional and you've got fight dates that are more spread apart, great. However, chances are you're probably fighting more regularly than that. So I'd probably stay away from that. And also in powerlifting, the stimulus stays the same. You're gonna, I don't know, squat, bench press, deadlift, or variations of for a number of weeks at a time. In boxing, the training sessions change like that, so it's probably not so easy to do that. So when to rest part 2. This is another fact. This is another really interesting thing to look at in your training, and that is supercompensation. So different qualities take different amounts of time to recover. So what's really interesting, if you look at the diagram, is that your, for example, speed, you probably need to be sprinting once every 5 days to maintain this. Strength, however, probably maintains, and I've experimented with this figure myself, but supposedly maintains for about 30 days. Now, I've tried not training for 2 weeks and found my strength held up pretty well. Don't think I'd risk 30, but what that means is, for example, if you've built a strength base, it's going to be much easier to maintain it. You might need to strength train a lot less than you think you do. However, if your sprinting speed is going to deteriorate if you don't train it at least once a week, then you want to be sprinting more regularly. This is why if I'm programming training for a boxer, ideally we want to build strength as far away from the fight as possible, so that when the fight starts nearing and sparring becomes the priority, we know the boxer isn't going to lose strength and they're not going to lose power. Now, skill is a really interesting one. For me, this is why, for example, you'll see someone like Mike Tyson can drop people in a charity boxing match, But for example, David Hay makes his comeback and his power's still there, but his timing's way off. For me, timing and skill will always be the #1 priority of any sport. When it comes to strength and conditioning, my philosophy is that you need to program in such a way that allows the athlete to repeat the skill as frequently as possible. So you're looking at injury prevention and obviously conditioning them so that, one, they don't break down, but two, they've got the engine and the gears to repeat a skill as explosively and frequently as possible. So if you're in your off season, sprint still once a week and make sure that your aerobic work is ticking over nicely. But strength training, you can get strong in the off season and then, for example, do a lot less work to actually maintain that strength. When to rest part 2. So deloads, as I've said, you can reduce volume, intensity or frequency. My personal favorite method would be to reduce volume, so you keep that intensity high. It's very, like, you'd never go into the ring and box at 50% pace, like not unless you've blown your gasket. So chopping volume for me would be the preferred method. Now, go hard or go home, fact or fiction. Some fact in it, in the sense that, for example, if it's just not there today, it's not there. I know there's some people who would go organize their training in what they call a high-low system. So Monday will be high intensity, Tuesday might be more technical work and mobility, which again isn't high intensity. So go hard or go home. There is some kind of logic to it, but trying to understand the intricacies of the body is difficult. So even training isn't as simple as saying, right, here's your 12-week block, we'll chat in 3 months, see you later. You need to have some kind of metrics or fatigue markers to see how well an athlete is responding to training and whether or not you need to peel back. If you're working with a quality strength and conditioning coach, they should know when your body is starting to struggle and when the deloads are needed. They should be able to advise you how you're feeling. So for example, sometimes it's okay not to feel great as an athlete, provided that that's where your coach has planned for you to get to in terms of digging that hole. If you feel rubbish and it's week 2, you really need to look at what your coach has been making you do. As I said, recovery is just as important as the training itself. And secondly, if you feel like you don't need a deload, you've either lying to yourself or you've probably not been training hard enough. If we want to improve physiological systems, we need to train hard enough. So again, whilst you can sum up any training approach with 5 words like go hard or go home, this is too simplistic. But that said, if you don't have it in the tank today, it's probably worth resting or bringing the intensity down to a point where you can get through the session rather than risking injury. But ultimately, that's going to be a case-by-case decision. As I said, you need to have a rough idea of where your training should have you at any point. So thank you for listening. I hope you found that useful. If you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch with me by your preferred channel. If you'd like to support more of this content, head over to my Patreon, and I'll catch you again in the next video.